outside Philadelphia brings heartbreak to a family and terror to a community. A young woman is dead, the killer gone. But the marks of his passage remain. South of Chicago, another mystery. A missing boy. A frantic search. Heartbreaking clues. Investigators struggle to find the boy and whoever took him. When victims are young, crime hurts that much more. And when the criminals are repeat offenders, it's a cruel turn of fate. Authorities are dedicated to solving these crimes and terminating the careers of those who are out to kill. At about 2 a.m. on June 20th, 1996, an off-duty ambulance crewman spotted a car abandoned on the road. It was parked on an exit ramp off Interstate 476, heading west away from Philadelphia. The car was running, and the headlights and radio were on. But no one was inside. The driver radioed 911. The emergency operator took the report, then dispatched 2 nearby troopers to the scene.
We will send a trooper out to the scene as soon as possible.
State Police Lieutenant Lenny Bandy was notified and headed to the highway interchange.
When the car was discovered, it was found with its driver's door open, the headlights were on, the radio was playing, and the engine was running. That was unusual to me.
It looked like a crime. The State Police Forensic Services Unit, headed by Corporal Alan Stewart, arrived at the scene.
Well, there was blood in front of the vehicle, and at that point I knew it was urgent to get everything started as quickly as possible.
At the front of the car was a tire iron. Near it, a small pool that appeared to be blood.
It was more than just an abandoned vehicle to me at that point. And it was a missing person investigation. It certainly was under suspicious circumstances with the presence of the tire iron and blood in front of the car and the hasty manner in which it appeared the occupant had left.
We collected the blood with the Q-tip, packaged it, we sent that out to the lab for DNA purposes.
Careful not to upset any potential evidence, they searched the car's interior and found a backpack. It appeared to be a college student's, but there was no identification inside. The car was registered to a woman in Brookhaven, Pennsylvania. Investigators learned the car was driven by her 22-year-old daughter, Aimee.
1974.
While troopers spoke with Aimee's parents, the crime scene processing continued.
One of the troopers had seen a pair of panties and shoes laying on a hillside. We went back to retrieve the pair of panties and shoes at that location.
Aimee's mother later identified the shoes as her daughter's. It was looking more and more like a forcible abduction. Next to the clothing, troopers spotted a distinct tire impression, which was photographed.
Upon completion of the photographs, then we used dental stone to cast the tire impression.
The impression was sent to the crime lab. Aimee's parents were worried. They knew the effects of crime firsthand.
Her father was a police officer. Her mother was an emergency room nurse. We wanted to do everything in our power to bring this young girl home safely to her family.
They had been out of town and hadn't seen their daughter in several days.
Very likely wearing this necklace at her
but knew that Aimee had planned to go out with friends that night. Her parents gave a description of their 22-year-old daughter, including the tattoo on her ankle.
If you don't mind, I'd like to keep this picture so I can distribute it.
Do you want others?
As the APB went out for the missing college student, the Philadelphia area press jumped on the story.
She'll be right up for you, sir.
By morning, the media coverage brought forward Aimee's friends, who had been with her the night before.
We were trying to retrace Aimee's whereabouts, reconstruct her activities from the time that she was last heard from to the time that her car was found.
All of Aimee's friends had the same story. It was an impromptu reunion of high school friends. They talked for a few hours, catching up. Friends said when Aimee left the bar around 1:30 a.m., she was alone.
What's going on with her?
No one had seen or heard from her since.
Also had a denim jacket as well.
Tell me what happened.
At Delaware County's Criminal Investigation Division, Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer and Detective Charles List were shocked to hear their friend's daughter was missing.
I've known Paul for a number of years. I know Aimee's mother, so we wanted to do anything we could to help with the investigation.
Detective Sergeant Seltzer contacted their superior, who immediately put them on the case.
I went to the captain, who was the chief of county detectives, and explained to him that we have a police officer's daughter that's been missing.
While search teams looked for Aimee, a task force gathered at the state police barracks to plan the intense investigation.
We utilized what's known as victimology. We wanted to learn about Aimee and her behaviors and the patterns of her conduct. We learned that she was a regular kid.
Aimee Willard was a star athlete at George Mason University, a responsible student taking summer classes. No ties to anything or anyone dangerous. By 5 p.m., 15 hours had passed with no sign of the missing girl.
While we were in the meeting, they received a call from Philadelphia police that they had a body and it matched the description of Aimee.
Children had discovered the nude body that afternoon in an isolated area of North Philadelphia. It was 25 miles from Aimee's car. There was no purse or clothing on or near the body, but everyone knew who it was.
That's Aimee.
The physical characteristics, the size, the height and weight, it was consistent with the description given to us by Aimee's family, and most specifically the presence of a tattoo on her right ankle, which was consistent with the tattoo that Aimee had.
Finding Aimee this way was difficult for everyone involved. Before the autopsy, her parents confirmed their daughter's identity. The medical examiner determined the young woman had died of multiple blunt force trauma to the head and body. It was a vicious attack.
When we were at the autopsy, we noticed there was a pattern on her right side that was in the shape of squares with the X's in the middle of the squares that were actually burned into her right side.
The burn pattern was so distinctive, investigators believed if they could find its source, they could find the killer. The medical examiner also recovered semen and believed the victim was sexually assaulted. The fluid and samples of Aimee's blood were sent to the lab for testing. At the Pennsylvania State Police Regional Crime Lab in Lima, experts determined the blood found near the car was Aimee Willard's. The seminal fluid recovered from the victim was also analyzed. Using a technique known as PCR, examiners made millions of copies of an isolated DNA strand until it was large enough to decipher. Once they could read it, they put together a genetic profile of the possible assailant but they got no hits on any DNA database. Still, it was crucial evidence, according to Delaware County Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt.
We had the genetic profile of the killer. We just didn't have a name to go along with that profile.
They also believed they had his tire print. Lieutenant Dennis Luce, commander of training and technical support at the crime lab, examined the tire cast.
The cast that we were looking at was a tire that had 4 grooves and 5 raised areas. So when we did our search of the database, we were only looking at tires that had the same number of grooves. We determined from the database that it was a Firestone FR440 tire.
Although it was a common tire, it might help confirm or eliminate a suspect. Investigators also needed to examine the burn pattern from the victim's body.
We believed if we could find the source of that pattern injury, we could find out who the killer was.
From the burn pattern, a pathologist tried to determine the shape and dimensions of the object that made it.
Although he couldn't tell us what the object was, he drew a picture of what the object looked like.
The investigative team had a great deal of evidence: the burn pattern, the tire track, and the genetic profile of the killer. But they had no idea who he was. Knowing why Aimee stopped her car might help identify the killer.
I have no idea.
Both Mom and Dad assured us the only reason she would stop if a police officer had pulled her over.
A police impersonator, a frightening possibility, but a real one. As the first few crucial days of the investigation passed with no solid leads, the law enforcement community grew frustrated.
It was a virtual whodunit. It was a needle in a haystack.
A vicious killer had stolen the life of this well-loved young woman, the daughter of a cop and a nurse, one of their own. And the investigators of Delaware County would never give up until they found him. In Delaware County, Pennsylvania, state police and county detectives were investigating the brutal homicide of 22-year-old college student Aimee Willard. Many knew Aimee, the daughter of a local police officer and a nurse. Investigators had good physical evidence, including a distinctive burn pattern on the body and the DNA profile of the suspected killer, but no suspects. One theory is that Aimee stopped that night because someone impersonating a cop made her pull over. Detective Charles List sought information on known police impersonators.
I was surprised at how many police impersonators there were out there. We had a lot of interviews to do.
Many of those interviewed had solid alibis. But not everyone did.
No, I do not own Black Honda.
One suspect had a record of trying to pull over women.
You weren't on Route 1 at the entrance of Route 1?
Investigators could not corroborate his alibi for the night Aimee was killed. And he worked near the place where the body was found. Detectives got a search warrant that allowed them to take a sample of the suspect's blood to compare his DNA against the DNA collected from the victim. State Police Lieutenant Lenny Bandy knew the genetic material was their greatest ally.
That was the most conclusive piece of evidence that we can use to include or exclude someone in our investigation.
The sample was sent to the lab for processing.
Yes.
The suspect in question also drove a car that could support the type of tire that left the impression near Aimee's clothing. Examiners compared the tire cast from the scene to an inked impression of the suspect's tires. But reported no match. DNA experts eventually reported similar results. No match. The suspect was cleared.
There were numerous calls, tips that were made by the public. We were overwhelmed early on.
Despite checking every lead, they came up with nothing. Months passed. Frustration grew. Detective Charles List and Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer eliminated every known police impersonator. They had no idea why Aimee pulled off the road. Then, late on the night of May 29, 1997, almost a year after Aimee Willard's death, 19-year-old nursing student Patty Jordan had just left a nightclub in Philadelphia and was driving home.
I noticed that a car was coming behind me with their headlights speeding up behind me. So I just kept my eye on him, and I switched lanes, and then he switched lanes with me, and then I did it again, and so did he, and I sped up, and so did he. I slowed down, and so did he.
The daughter of a Philadelphia police officer, Patty knew she needed to find her father.
I thought to myself, I was going to the 2nd Police District. That's the police district by my house. And then I would just pull in there and call my dad.
Off the interstate, she stopped at a red light.
And that's when he just slowly came up from behind me. I could see him, I could see his headlights, and I thought to myself, this guy's gonna hit my car. And that's when he hit my car. And then that's when I was like, oh my God, what is this guy doing? He kept motioning for me to pull over and pull over, just to pull over. I was mad and I was scared.
But Patty Jordan was not going to pull over.
And I just thought, I'm getting this guy's plate number. I'm gonna tell my dad.
Eventually, the man turned and drove away, but not before Patty got the plate.
I said it over and over in my head, and as soon as I came home and saw my brother, I ran to the kitchen and wrote it down.
Sergeant John Jordan is Patty's father.
The murder of Aimee Willard had been in the news, so I entered the tag into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and it came back to an Arthur Bomar. And I noticed that the registration was to a Ford Escort.
But Patty said the man was driving a Honda. Sergeant Jordan also found out that Arthur Bomar was a convicted murderer who was wanted for a parole violation in Nevada.
And the more I thought about that and what had happened to my daughter, I just had to call Delaware County. Detective Sergeant Seltzer and his partner, Detective Charlie List, spoke to my daughter. And I could see the look on their face. I'll never forget the look on both their faces as they listened to Patty recount what happened to her.
Patty's description of the driver who bumped her matched that of Arthur Bomar.
Can you tell us what happened?
Although the plate was registered to a Ford Escort, Patty said she was sure it was a dark-colored Honda behind her.
I-95, and that's when I noticed that
The plate might have been switched. It was their best lead by far.
It was the entire case. It was the entire case. There was nothing, I can't describe how important that was, just for her to grab that tag number and tell us. We wanted very much to speak with Mr. Bomar.
At first, they could not find the parolee. But after such a long and frustrating investigation, the investigators were surprised at how quickly the case took off.
We were a year into the investigation and following up every lead we could. Arthur Bomar comes into the picture within 3 days. Arthur Bomar is in custody.
Detective Sergeant Seltzer and Detective List went to interview Bomar at the Lower Marion Police Station, where he was being held on burglary charges. Bomar denied knowing anything about Aimee Willard and said he had never been to the part of North Philadelphia where her body was found.
And you're still saying that you were...
He admitted he'd been to the bar Aimee went to the night of her murder, but claimed he was not there that night. He was at a birthday party.
All right, Mr. Bomar.
After speaking with family members, we found that it was a lie, that he wasn't at the birthday party.
Securing a search warrant, investigators took samples of Bomar's cheek cells and hair to compare his DNA to the DNA recovered from the victim. The analysis at the busy State Police Crime Lab would take a few days. But because Bomar was in jail on another charge, Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt knew they had time.
Okay, Charlie.
A Montgomery County judge denied Bomar bail.
So there was no chance of him being back out on the street before we concluded our investigation. We had a lot of forensic evidence, and we wanted to carefully put all that evidence together because we only get one shot at him in court, and we wanted to make it a good one.
Police searched the area near where Bomar was arrested for burglary. Officers found a car with the same plate numbers Patty Jordan had given to her father. The plate was registered to a Ford Escort, but it was on a black Honda, just as Patty described. Technicians later found no evidence in the Honda related to the Aimee Willard case. They needed to find that Escort. The case was heating up, but mysteries remained. The missing car, the peculiar burn pattern, and whether or not DNA would clear this suspect. After a year-long search, the investigators of Delaware County hoped they could solve these mysteries and find some degree of justice for a murdered young woman. Near Philadelphia, 22-year-old Aimee Willard was abducted, sexually assaulted, and killed, left with a distinct burn pattern on the side of her body. A year later, Pennsylvania investigators had a suspect in custody. Arthur Bomar said he had nothing to do with Aimee's death and claimed he wasn't at the bar where Aimee was last seen alive. But detectives tracked down Bomar's girlfriend, and she had a different story. She was in hiding and fearful of Bomar. She said Bomar told her he was going to the bar in question on the night of the murder.
He start talking about.
Bomar confessed to his girlfriend that he watched Aimee Willard leave the bar and followed her. He forced her to pull over, though the girlfriend didn't know how. Bomar said he then knocked Aimee unconscious. He took her to North Philadelphia, where he raped and killed her. The girlfriend said Bomar was driving his Ford Escort that night. The statement of the girlfriend was a major break, but investigators needed evidence to back it up in court. Delaware County Detective Charles List and Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer believed the key was Bomar's Ford Escort.
His vehicle is very important because at some point Aimee was in that car.
Absolutely.
We went to an insurance company and found they had been in an accident shortly after Aimee's abduction.
The detectives learned the car was towed to a salvage lot.
We obtained a search warrant. We were hoping to find some type of blood, hair, fiber that would link Aimee Willard to Arthur Bomar.
When the tow truck lifted the car, investigators were stunned. The oil pan had a familiar pattern. They believed it was the object that burned Aimee's body. At the State Police Garage, the Forensic Services Unit processed the car.
What's that?
On the passenger side door panel, they found what appeared to be dried blood.
I'll take it down to the lab.
They removed the oil pan so it could be compared to photos of the burn pattern on the victim's body.
Yeah, that's it.
The technicians also collected the car's tires to check them against the tire impression from the scene of the abduction. Corporal Alan Stewart was part of the Forensic Services Unit.
We sent the oil pan to a pattern expert from the Armed Services, who then in fact did match the oil pan to the pattern that was on Aimee's body.
Lieutenant Dennis Luce compared the tire cast from the crime scene to the print of a Firestone FR 440 tire from Bomar's car.
We were able to determine by comparing the track to the suspect tire that both had the same amount of wear.
Sergeant Luce, I finished looking at that tire track that you sent in, that tire you sent in,
It's consistent with the track from the crime scene.
Serology expert Cecilia Cassiola examined the door panel and found Aimee Willard's blood.
Finding the victim's blood in the suspect's car puts the victim in the suspect's car.
But the most important forensic evidence came with the DNA results. It was a match. Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt.
The DNA evidence was irrefutable here. There was a 5 billion and 1 chance that Arthur Bomar was not the person who contributed the DNA found during the autopsy. So that obviously was the foundation of our case. In addition, we were able to link the car he drove to the thermal injury on Aimee's body. Aimee's blood was found behind the door panel in his car. The tires on Arthur Bomar's car left tire track impressions at the abduction scene.
It was enough to convince the jury. On October 1st, 1998, Arthur Bomar was convicted of first-degree murder, rape, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to death. Aimee's family has fought for the laws to be changed to keep offenders behind bars, but the law did not pass in time to protect an Illinois family. Aroma Park is an hour south of Chicago. On an afternoon in 1995, Micah Moulton got nervous when her 10-year-old son Christopher did not come home from fishing at 5 o'clock as expected. It was not long before she had a feeling something was terribly wrong.
I jumped up and I looked at the clock. It said 5:22, and I knew immediately I needed to go find him. I had to go find him at that moment.
Leaving her other kids at the house in case Christopher returned, she went down to the Aroma Park boat ramp on the Kankakee River, where Christopher normally fished.
I walked around the area, I called his name, started yelling out for him.
After more than an hour of searching, Micah called the Kankakee County Sheriff's Department. Under Sheriff Brad O'Keefe worried when he heard where the boy was last seen.
The speed of that river, we have a lot of drownings. A lot of people fall in and disappear in that river, so that makes it dangerous in itself.
Rich, not a Aroma Park Boat Club right away. You got a missing 10-year-old.
Micah told Deputy Rich Burns about Christopher. She had already checked with all of his friends. No one had seen him since 4:30 at the boat launch.
It was very unusual for him to do this, for him not to return home on time, and we knew it was very important to get the ball rolling, to get the search started.
He's 10 years old.
And I said, well, I'm going to go in the woods and look for him. He said, just wait. He said, hold on. And he made a couple of radio calls, and the next thing I knew, there were search dogs and search teams and the fire department out there.
We didn't know if he had fallen into the river or if he had walked off, if he was just lost.
Right away, they threw every resource into the search.
All the local police agencies sent people. So we had fire departments from Aroma Park and Kankakee. They had the boats in the water doing the search. Once they knew what we were looking for, a lot of the citizens came up and volunteered.
They briefed the search parties, describing Christopher, his clothing, his bicycle. The searchers were instructed not to touch anything they found.
We don't know what happened at this point.
Any evidence should be collected by trained evidence technicians.
Anything you find, call Detective Bertrand. We're going to process it and handle it as evidence. Detective Bertrand will come out and collect it. All right? So everybody go
They had to
over here and line up
organize
along these woods.
and stay organized.
We have an assistant in the command center who keeps track of who's where and who's doing what searches.
Fire department personnel checked the water and riverbanks. search dogs tried to track the young boy. Everyone prayed they would find Christopher quickly. Investigators interviewed anyone they could locate at the boat launch.
Sit over there. Did you see Christopher Meyer? Yes, ma'am. What did you guys see? Tell me everything you saw.
Two boys said they saw Chris with a man that afternoon, according to Kankakee County Administrative Chief Joe Mulcahy.
The man had a fishing tackle box with him, and in the box was some lures that were not appropriate for this area. It was saltwater lures, and the man did tell them that he was originally from this area, but had just came back from Florida.
The boys said there was a fillet knife in the box with the lures. They saw Christopher and the man leave the riverbank together. They could give only a vague description. A white male, tall, a mustache.
He had like all this neat stuff.
And we were concerned that there may be a possible abduction at that point.
No one slept.
We had detectives in here fielding calls all night. We had people searching the woods. We searched that woods 20 times, hoping that we would find something.
But that night, they didn't. Local news stations ran the story, broadcasting descriptions of Christopher and the unknown man he was seen with, and asking for more help. At the Sheriff's Emergency Operations Center, deputies and volunteers fielded calls. Many were tips suggesting they look into certain men as possible suspects. Investigators followed up on every tip, while the search continued, firemen dragging the river bottom. More than 18 hours had passed with no sign of Christopher. Then, the next morning, searchers spotted something in the water. A child's sneaker. Micah identified it as Christopher's.
We now have a shoe in the water. Chances are better now that he's in the water or something's there, so we got to intensify the search there.
Dive teams searched for any sign of the boy or his bike.
It would overhear people talking about, any news, did they find a body? And a couple of times I lost it and said, there's not going to be a body, they're going to bring home Christopher. And I just kept a positive outlook on it, because I couldn't ever let myself think or feel that he wasn't going to come home.
Those searching for Christopher would not give up either. That little boy was out there somewhere, and they needed to bring him home. 10-year-old Christopher Meyer was last seen with an unknown man near the Kankakee River in Aroma Park, Illinois. Investigators did not know if Christopher had been abducted or if he fell in the river where they had recovered one of the boy's sneakers. Micah Moulton is Christopher's mother.
I felt everything was going to be okay, or eventually I was going to wake up, that this was just a really bad dream.
But it was no dream.
I got something here.
On the second day, one search team spotted something. Christopher's bicycle. It appeared someone had carried the bike deep into the woods and tried to conceal it, according to Undersheriff Brad O'Keefe.
It's that much more critical. We're not searching anymore for a lost child. We're not searching anymore for a drowned child.
Now they knew someone had taken Christopher. Several witnesses said they saw Christopher pushing his bike with a white male who had a goatee. They said at one point the man was standing by the open trunk of a gray four-door sedan that had fishing rods in the back window.
Just a short.
He had a fillet knife in a leather case in his back pocket. Some of the witnesses worked with a police artist to create a composite sketch of the man.
Great.
Investigators released the sketch to the media.
Once the picture was out, everybody had somebody in mind. So we're getting all kinds of tips and clues on who it might be.
Deputies followed up with every caller to the tip line.
We took them a composite sketch and asked them to look at it and identify it.
Yeah, that's a bus.
One name came up more than any other, Timothy Buss.
When was the last time you saw him?
Fairly new to the community, Micah Moulton did not know the name.
No, we just need to ask him.
And I remember somebody coming in and saying, Timothy Buss, oh my God, I can't believe he's out. And they kept going on, and I said, who is like, Timothy Buss? Who is this Tim Buss? Who is this Timothy Buss? And nobody would tell me.
The investigators all knew Buss. In 1981, Timothy Buss had abducted and murdered a 5-year-old girl in nearby Bradley, Illinois. He was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years. But he had been recently paroled. Lieutenant Larry Osenga of the Kankakee City Police Department's Violent Crimes Task Force offered his squad's assistance. They asked around Buss's old neighborhood.
The neighbors advised us, yes, he was in the community.
Kankakee police learned Buss was now living in Joliet, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago. Lieutenant Osenga called Joliet Police Department. Joliet agreed to check on Buss's apartment.
So Joliet assisted us. We went to where his residence was. He was not there at the time.
But the Joliet police sat and waited. The searches in the Aroma Park area kept on as another terrible night passed. Then, 2 days after Christopher disappeared, the Joliet surveillance unit spotted a man approaching Buss's apartment. It looked like the suspect. He was alone. Joliet contacted the Kankakee officers, who immediately drove up to the city.
You did spare one place? Yeah, about an hour now. Did you see him go anywhere? Sure he's in, right?
They checked the apartment,
When was the last time you saw him?
but no one answered. The place seemed deserted.
Hey, what's going on?
A neighbor noticed the police and told them she had seen Buss go out the back door.
He ran out of his apartment, jumped in his car with his headlights off, and he drove off at a high rate of speed and got away from us. We began a perimeter search trying to locate him, and we were not able to locate him.
A search of the apartment yielded no sign of the missing boy. APBs went out to law enforcement throughout the greater Chicago area with descriptions of Timothy Buss and his car.
Aimee County Sheriff's Office, can I help you?
People began recognizing the sketch. A motel clerk in Braidwood, Illinois, called to say she thought Buss was staying there. Kankakee County sent Deputy Brady Bertrand to the motel in Braidwood, 25 miles south of Joliet.
At about 8 o'clock in the morning, Buss come out of the hotel and walked directly over to a dumpster in the parking lot of the hotel. He threw a pair of boots in the dumpster.
Deputy Bertrand radioed for assistance.
I'm just gonna stick with them. Need someone to come back and put boots on the dumpster.
Then he followed the suspect.
He initially got on I-55 northbound, which leads into the city of Chicago, but he ended up getting off a short distance later and driving to Wilmington and pulling down by the river and talking to some fishermen down there.
Deputy Bertrand waited for backup to arrive.
Stand by till you get there.
While he did, Kankakee County detectives Ron Kilman and Randy Hartman responded to the Braidwood Motel to collect the evidence.
The boots were retrieved. We're not sure what
evidence that is going to be connected to, but he apparently put them there for a reason. So we secured them, whether there was possible blood located on them, hairs or fibers.
The boots were sent to the lab for analysis. The Kankakee officers hoped they could get Bus to talk.
Yeah.
He was very antsy and looking around as if he wanted to get away from there, but he had no place to go.
Every time something goes wrong, you guys gonna start coming to me. Yeah, we are.
At first, the parolee was evasive, not wanting to talk.
And we'll get it worked out.
But eventually, he agreed to come to the Kankakee County Sheriff's Department for an interview.
This ain't right.
At the station, Bus denied knowing anything about Christopher Meyer. His lawyer arrived to discuss investigators' request for a consent to search Bus's car.
I didn't have anything.
Against the lawyer's advice, Bus signed the consent form.
I have nothing to hide, nothing at all.
At the Sheriff's Department garage, detectives Hartman and Kilman processed the suspect's car.
As a crime scene detective, we're basically putting a story together. And if you can do your job well enough, then you find that evidence that's able to tell you that story.
In the trunk, they discovered a car dent puller that appeared to have blood on it. There was also a tire iron and a tackle box like the one described by the boys who last saw Christopher. There was no fillet knife inside.
As we removed the items one at a time, then we were able to observe on the carpeting itself underneath the tools that there was a considerable amount of blood.
It was a difficult find, but an important one.
If in fact this was going to turn into a homicide, we needed to be able to put the boy and the suspect together.
Inside, the technicians also found a claw hammer.
It had dirt in the claw portion. What that told us was somebody's been doing some digging with this hammer.
On the passenger seat, the technicians recovered several head hairs. Like the other evidence, the hairs would be sent to forensics experts at the Illinois State Police Crime Lab. They had a suspect in custody and haunting evidence of foul play.
We still don't know where Chris is. We don't know if Chris is maybe hurt and bleeding. We were hoping we would find him stashed in a cabin or something along the river. So we never gave up hope that he would still be alive.
In 1995, Kankakee County, Illinois investigators were searching for 10-year-old Christopher Meyer, who was abducted while fishing. Evidence technicians found blood, hairs, and a dirt-encrusted hammer in the car of Timothy Bus, who had been seen with Christopher the day the boy disappeared.
They came in.
Our investigations led us to believe that you have...
Authorities arrested Bus and charged him with aggravated kidnapping.
Every time a child misses, you come. You know this ain't right. You know this ain't right.
He refused to cooperate. At the Illinois State Police Forensics Lab, DNA research coordinator William Frank examined the evidence from Bus's trunk. He would compare the blood from those items to a DNA parentage profile created from Christopher's parents and to a probable sample of the boy's DNA called a convenience standard.
The convenience standard that was used was the child's asthma inhaler.
From the swabs of the inhaler and the parents' blood samples, Frank created a genetic profile using PCR testing.
The parentage comparison from the child's parents was consistent with the inhaler.
He then checked that profile against the blood from the car.
When I compared the profile that was identified in the asthma inhaler to the profile that was identified in the blood stains from the suspect's vehicle, the two profiles matched.
They still held out hope that the boy was alive. Kankakee County Sheriff Bernie Thompson.
After Timothy Bus was in custody, we were still looking for Christopher.
And there was always that hope that we would find him alive.
A few days later, a search party that included Sheriff's investigator Kenneth Ponton discovered a pair of boys' briefs and later a fishing pole and part of a T-shirt.
We called Investigator Mulcahy and gave her the description of the items and asked her to check with the missing boy's mother, which she did, and the mother was able to identify that these items belonged to her son.
3 days later, in a part of Kankakee State Park, Will County deputies made the discovery that would finally end the search. Under a piece of plywood, partially buried, was the body of a small boy. He had been stabbed more than 50 times with a thin knife. It was Christopher. Evidence technicians collected a clump of dirt containing a boot print from the gravesite. They also collected samples of the soil in the area. Hair and fiber expert Ralph Meyer compared the hairs found in Timothy Buss's car to Christopher's using a comparison microscope.
Looking at the general appearance, the length, the distribution of the pigmentation, the fusi throughout the shaft, ovoid bodies.
The hairs were microscopically consistent in every regard. Geologist Ken Knight examined the soil samples taken from the gravesite and the soil found on the claw hammer.
We tried to determine if the knowns and unknowns had the same characteristics, the same amount of crystals or mineral particles, same colors, same angularity of those particles, the same general type of botanical material.
Again, a match.
The fact that the soil from the hammer is consistent with a mixture of the soil samples from the gravesite indicates that the hammer was used to actually dig the grave.
Some of that soil held a partial impression of a boot print. Forensic scientist Robert Hunton compared boots Buss threw out at the motel to that impression.
I made a cast of that particular portion of the boot that had a similar pattern to the piece of soil. I compared those side by side. I was able to say that that impression could have been made by that portion, that small area of the right boot.
Investigators hoped more definitive proof would come from the DNA lab. William Frank checked samples from the victim's femur against the evidence he already had.
The genetic profile for the femur bone matches the genetic marker profile identified for the child's inhaler and also matches the bloodstains identified in the trunk from the suspect's car.
The forensic evidence proved that Timothy Buss abducted Christopher Meyer. He assaulted the boy, stabbed him repeatedly, then buried him in the woods. Buss was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and was sentenced to death. That sentence was commuted to life in January 2003, but this time there will be no chance of parole. Christopher's mother, Micah Moulton.
The anger and the sadness and the grief and all was so overwhelming, but I knew I could use it in a positive way to make a difference. I want laws changed. I helped in lobbying for the No Second Chances for Murderers, Rapists, and Child Molesters law, also known as Aimee's law.
That law, named for murdered college student Aimee Willard, seeks to prevent the most violent criminals from being released on parole. It was passed by the U.S. Congress in 2000.